So I'm going to give you one more example and then stop. So the example I'm going to talk about is now learning, right? So I'm going to talk about, so we've so far talked about adaptation, evolutionary selection of circuits to be adapted to the world. And now I want to talk about something that isn't evolutionary selection for adaptation to the world, but rather involves learning. So there are songbirds. Here are two kinds of songbirds, zebra finches and the brown-headed cowbird. And famously, songbirds learn to sing by imitation, practice, and innovation. By the way, the reason why we should care is humans do the same thing. Here's a human learning by practice, right? So that is a very important part of animal activity, to learn by practice and to get good at something. So how do songbirds learn? Well, it turns out the juvenile male bird babbles, and just goes on like that. And then over weeks, it learns to sing, clearly partly through imitation, because its song will partly imitate the songs it hears, often of its parent, with some innovation. And then the adult male bird sings to female birds, often seeking a mate. And then the female birds seem to evaluate these songs and then decide which one or which ones to accept. And this is all really important, right? It matters. Because, for example, in social species like this cowbird, the males and females work out a kind of social hierarchy based on their singing to each other. And then they produce pair bonds. And the success of those pair bonds is absolutely critical for later success in egg laying. You don't make the pair bonds, the colony doesn't produce very many eggs. So it's actually really important for the survival of the species that this is all well organized and that the males learn to sing. So how do they do this? So now, let me tell you about how all of these circuits I've talked about reorganize themselves. They reorganize themselves when neurons, which are connected to each other, autonomously rewire their circuits, right? There's a rule, and they'll use the rule to reorganize. There are various sorts of rules, and one of the rules, one of these mechanisms, is called spike timing dependent plasticity. So let me give you an example. Suppose you have two neurons, 1 and 2, and they're connected, and here's the synapse between them. Suppose for some reason they both fire, right? They both produce these voltage spikes that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. Suppose neuron 1 fires before neuron 2. You could have a rule that says the synapse strengthens. Or you could have a rule that the first, and you also, the second part of the rule says that if neuron 1 fires after the second one, the synapse weakens. So this is just a local rule, right? I mean, just a dynamical rule. You've got two dumb objects, neuron 1 and neuron 2, talking to each other, and they just have a rule, right? They either strengthen the synapse or weaken the synapse, depending on who goes first. You can modify this a little bit. There are things called neuromodulators, which are sort of chemicals that the brain uses. And these can be used as global knobs to affect how this happens. So for example, there's a thing called dopamine, which if dopamine is released here, it can reinforce changes that happen to have led offline to some sort of reward. So if there's a reward, they'll do something to help cement some change that's happened in the synapse. There's other things like norepinephrine that also, allow emotion to control how the synapses changes and everything. And you can put all of these rules in computers and see what they do and so on. It just seems really implausible at first sight that something so stupid, if you like, can actually lead to things like actual learning of things you might care about. In the case of the birds, for example, allowing them to learn songs. But let's see. So how does song learning actually work in the actual brains of birds? So here's the bird brain. And what's written down here is all the different major brain areas. Remember, we talked about brain areas. And these are the brain areas that sort of cooperate collectively to help the bird to learn songs. Three important ones are HVC, RA, and LMAN, acronyms with some historic provenance. What's very interesting about this system is that this region, RA, has neurons in it, which are the things that control the muscles. So these are the things that actually produce the song. So a sequence of firing of the neurons in the region RA will make a whole bunch of muscles go back and forth in the bird's throat and thereby produce the song. So that's the thing that makes song. So to make a song, of course, you need to control those muscles in a particular order. Control these muscles first, then these muscles, and these muscles, and these muscles, and that makes the song. So that's what you've got to learn. So this area of the, so RA also gets input from another area called HVC, and HVC acts as a conductor. So the neurons in this area produce patterns like this and this and this and this and this, if you like, but it's actually patterns of neuron firing, and they provide a time base. Every pattern of firing of neurons in this area HVC marks out a different time in the song. It's literally conducting the song. So when HVC produces this pattern, certain neurons here in the area RA should fire, thereby pushing certain muscles. When neurons in HVC fire in some other pattern, then some other neurons in RA should fire, producing another push, a different kind of push in the muscles. So that's what should be happening. So that's what it's got to learn. As the conductor marks out time, different muscles get pushed. So how does it learn this? Well, it turns out there's a third area called L-man, which is a tutor area. And this tutor area does two things. First, it drives exploration. You see, part of the problem is that the bird doesn't know which neurons control which muscles. Right? You don't know that. Just like baby doesn't know how to move its neurons in its head in order to control their muscles. It's something you learn. So here, L-man does two things. One is it drives exploration by injecting a little bit of randomness in the firing of RA that allows the neurons there to sort of just do slightly different things every time to explore what can be done. The other thing it does is it provides guidance. So this area gets back a message that says, how did the output compare to a remembered song? And based upon those differences between what you wanted and what you got, it's able to provide some guidance about which synapses to change, or, well, that was a good thing you did, or that was a bad thing you did. So able to provide guidance of this kind. So that's at the level of these brain areas collectively talking to each other. What about at the level of the individual neurons and the synapses? Because somehow here, at the end, every neuron is a dumb little thing. And all it knows is a dumb little rule about how it should change. So it turns out that right here, there are synapses between the conductor neurons and the student neurons, which have the following property. So if the conductor sends a message to the student, before the tutor, the synapse strengthens. If the conductor sends a message to the student at the same time as the tutor, then the synapse weakens. That's a measurement in this system. And otherwise, basically nothing happens. And this is for this particular synapse in this particular bird. This is the zebra finch. Other birds and other synapses can have different rules. So it would be a legitimate question to ask whether, can such a stupid rule actually allow a bird to learn a song? So you can check that, and the way neuroscientists, or at least theoretical neuroscientists, will do this is they'll build a computer model of the system. Right? So you make a model of the conductor area as a bunch of neurons. You allow the conductor neurons to send signals to all the student neurons. Then you say there's a tutor, and you get the tutor to send messages to the student neurons too. And then you say, I want the student to learn a particular pattern of firing, and you press go, and you say, can such a stupid rule, this spike timing dependent plasticity rule, where depending upon who fires first, you strengthen or weaken the synapse, can that work? So amazingly, it learns, this is capable of learning the correct sequential outputs. Right? You just tell it that I want this sequence of firing in this area, it can learn that output. But there's an interesting finding you can find out this way, right? And that is, the learning works better if the teaching style of the tutor matches the learning style of the student, the kind of thing you hear in kindergarten, right? So basically, you know, it could be that the neuron has this spike timing dependent plasticity rule. You know, if A goes before B, then you strengthen. If B goes before A, you weaken. Or it could have this spike timing dependent plasticity rule. You strengthen so long as both of these fire close to each other, right? Now, there are many different rules different neurons implement. So it turns out that for some of these rules of learning that an individual synapse could implement, it turns out the tutor should teach the student, give it signals so that it learns early segments of the song before late segments of the song. That's the way it's going to work best, given that rule of how the learning at the synapse works. But for other students, by which I mean other kinds of synaptic plasticity or learning rules at the synapse, you'll find that the teacher should just teach the whole song all the time, just keep giving corrections everywhere. And it'll work better. It'll just work faster. That's a very interesting finding, and this is intended to illustrate two things. One is, this kind of learning, it's a collective effect. The whole brain cooperates, and the synapses have to do things. So it's a collective of everything that's doing this effect. The first statement. The other statement is this kind of theoretical computer modeling that's now possible, given, I told you earlier, you can build a model of a neuron, and why not put it on a computer and just see what it does? You can now do that kind of thing and learn a great deal. In fact, this is a prediction for things that ought to be measurable in different kinds of birds and different kinds of synapses. So we're now reached the stage where you can have a sort of the style of science that was in physics, which is that you can have theory, you can have experiment, the theories make predictions, you can check it in experiments, the experiments refine the theories, etc. That is a mode of doing science that's been basically absent for much of neuroscience and much of biology, and that is now becoming possible because we have so many tools and so much knowledge of all of this. I'm basically out of time, so I'm not going to talk about the circuits that underlie our sense of space, unless you ask me during question time, in which I can tell you more, and instead I'm going to conclude. Right? So the point of my talk today was to try to suggest to you, say something about how our brains make us. And the kind of point I want to try to make to you is that inside our head, we're all collectives. It's not like there's a thing, which is you. There's just lots of neurons. Lots of neurons are connected in lots of circuits. The circuits are connected into brain areas. And collectively, the emergent effect of all of this is you. I tried to illustrate that by looking at various examples, and special cases of different kinds, in particular, for example, this learning. Another point that I'd like to emphasize is that in essentials, all animals are the same. Like this turtle and my daughter at an earlier age are basically, in all essentials, they're the same. All of the stuff we like about the fancy thinking we do is a veneer on top of that. Nevertheless, there's a lot more to discuss. So, for example, we're very interested as humans in decision-making, social behavior, things like curiosity and creativity, language, right, which humans have a particular faculty for language, abstract thought, which matters to us. And we'd like to understand the origins of all of these behaviors in neural circuits. And actually, there's progress on this. Just in the last 20 years, or last 10 years, there are more and more tools for studying all of these things, and I anticipate that the next decade will see lots of progress in understanding the neural circuit origin of these sorts of behaviors. Then, usually, most people are interested in an even broader question, right? One of the things we prize about ourselves is sentience and consciousness. So we'd like to know, what are these states? They're clearly states of brain, right? We don't all say that rocks are sentient or conscious. They're states of brain, but we don't quite know how to define even what sentience and consciousness even mean, sort of in general, let alone at the circuit level. Right? And we'd like to know from this, how does mind emerge from brain? But I actually think that we will make progress on these questions in the next 100 years, right? That might seem like a long time, but it isn't really. People live to 100. And if you think about it, we have come a heck of a long way since Cajal. Cajal had pictures of lots of different neurons and suggested that neurons are central to how the brain works. So there are these different things. They're like the atomic constituents of brains. And think about all the things I've been able to say today. And I even only just scratched the surface. So 100 years from now, I think there's every chance that we'd be able to give some sort of definition of what we mean by something that's conscious or sentient, and understand how those states arise from neural circuits. So I'm going to stop there.